Hello? Hello, how are you? Good afternoon. Are you okay? Everyone okay? It's going to be a very special afternoon. It's going to be a very crazy afternoon. This is a quite unique moment. I'm sure you're thrilled. You're going to be with Joe Abercrombie here today. He's going to be with us. For me, it's a very, very moving moment. This is such a nice room. Everything is so nice. You know, I do stand-up comedy. I work in very cheap bars. Very, very cheap bars. Very cheap. Have I said they're cheap bars? I've worked in bars where you were frisked on the door to see if you had a gun. And if you hadn't a gun, they gave you one. So you cannot imagine what it means to me. Because I was thinking, okay, it's 40 degrees outside. You all have had to take a decision. You could either stay home and make a cold cocoa drink, because it takes a while, you have to stir, and a tiny bit of milk, and say, what the fuck is this guy talking about? I want to talk up to Joe Abercrombie. Well, you have to wait. It's my turn now. And while you're doing the cold cocoa drink, you eat a little bit of cocoa powder, and then you cough, and you go like, and you know that's not. It's a chocolate color. You know that booger is chocolate color. It's a delicacy. You could be home now. You could stay home. You know, with that old trouser you have with a weird shape. And you're not home. You're here with us. You hear a lot of people who want to be paying attention to something that I find is amazing. One of the big needs of human beings is fantasy. One of the big needs of the human being is believing that we have routine, we have Instagram kitten pictures, but there are more things. We can deal with reality. Most of the people deal with reality one way. Most of the people deal with reality, you know, by buying a lotto ticket. They try to win a lottery draft, or they trust God, or but we don't do that. We work on fantasy. We look for our own kind of fantasy. We look for imagination in comic books, in books, in films. That's the big difference. I think that all of us here are people who want to deal with our own fantasy. We don't want anyone to give us fantasy. We look for fantasy ourselves, and we look for fantasy in books such as those by Joe Abercrombie. Well, I've said nothing before, but Juan hasn't been able to make it. No, I have, says Juan. I'm sorry, he is here. You see what I was saying about dealing with reality? Well, here we go with Juan Gómez Jurado. Thank you, please don't clap. Don't clap, because we have a real writer with us today. I had to laugh now, but I'm not funny, so. What can we say about Joe Abercrombie? You're not drinking your cocoa milk. You're here, you've gone under the heat. We have Joe Abercrombie with us. Please, Joe.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Siéntate, por favor.
Please sit down, Joe. I don't like to be with people who are better looking than I am, but this is what you get.
There's a slight delay on my translation, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm quite heavily microphoned up here. I feel like Locutus of Borg from Star Trek The Next Generation, whose head has been invaded with various devices. But we'll get there.
Okay, you can see that we don't need to speak. He can talk himself, and that's it. Joe is a very nice guy. and he can talk for himself. So we're redundant, especially Juan. Okay, I'll introduce the writer we have with us, just in case any of you don't know him. I hope you all do. Joe Abercrombie is one of my favorite writers. I don't say this because he's sitting by my side, and I don't say this because he's one head taller than I am. He is really one of my favorite writers. When I read The Blade itself, it was when it was first released in Spanish. And it was an accident, basically, but a very happy accident. Because the book, it was a very small run, you know, it was very expensive as well. And it was hard for me to get it. But the cover struck my eyes. You know, it was the cover that did it. And when I started reading The Blade itself, I was traumatized by what I was reading. The first scene, you know, when Sander Glotka, how do you say his name, by the way?
I say Sandan Glokta.
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 Nosotros decimos...
pues yo he leído otro libro, entonces.
No, it was a different book, the one that I read.
That different people can come to my books and pronounce the names their own way.
Ya, ahora te...
I feel when you've paid that exorbitant entrance fee for this highly priced hardcover you have, I think it's worth every penny, but whatever. You can pronounce the names however you please.
Gracias. Pues...
Thank you. Anyway, as I was saying, when I read the first scene, you know, when Glotka walks down the stairs, I realized that this was not a writer who was able to take me to his own world. He not only could do that, and there are many writers who can do that, but it was a writer who was a pure breed writer. You know, I just go down on my knees and I go like, I want to be like you when I'm older.
Si no habéis leído La voz de las espadas...
If you haven't read The Blade itself, if you've started by the YA trilogy, by the Shattered Sea, and you haven't reached the First Law trilogy, please do. Please read it. And when you read the first episode, the first chapter, cry. Just weep. Because it's one of the best beginnings of a book I've ever read. So this is Joe Abercrombie to me. Which book of his have you read? Most of them, but with other titles. Here goes the first question. Which is the order you suggest your books are to be read? The order you wrote them, or do you suggest people should start with the Shattered Sea and then go to the adult books?
There's a complicated and sophisticated answer to this question, which is the first step is to buy all of the books. And then you can really play it by ear. You can freestyle. You can actually not read them at all, if you like. You can even buy a second set. I understand that having them on ebook and hardcover, for example, is a good idea in this modern digital age of ours.
Vale, pero ahora en serio.
Now seriously, come on.
No, I would probably read them in publication order. I think that makes sense. I guess I was a little frustrated with the fact that fantasy seems over time to have become these bigger and bigger, weightier and weightier series of huger and huger books. And there's something lovely about losing yourself in a massive series full of detail and depth. But when I was a kid, I can remember Lord of the Rings feeling like the hugest of the huge, this massive undertaking. And these days, Lord of the Rings is half of one volume of some of the really big fantasy series out there. And so I was kind of keen not to make something that was too huge, too intimidating, that would kind of turn off the average reader. And so I wrote one massive trilogy, I'll admit. But then I thought it might be a good idea to write some standalone books that kind of happen in the same world, but that readers could dip in and out of, and maybe they could read one standalone book, go back and tackle a trilogy, go forward and read another. So I tried to write some books that wouldn't, you know, were modular, could be read in different orders and in different ways. And I think perhaps you get more if you start at the beginning. You see things that, you know, a new reader wouldn't see. But I wanted it to be possible to come to those later books and to derive some joy and adventure and love, all those other things we like from a fantasy book, without having to dip into a massive load. But since you've bought them all already, you can start wherever you like, really.
¿Sabes qué? Estuvo...
Do you know that in that same chair where you're sitting, Pat Rothfuss was 2 years ago. He had additional support, you know, he was a little bit heavier. But he told us that when writing the second part of quote history, the Wise Man's Fear, he realized that he had written a book which was just like the Hunger Games plus Harry Potter's latest book as far as word count was concerned. And he had written such a big book because he was not able to cut anything out. Rothfuss is a writer we all admire, but he doesn't have something you do have and which I admire, which is your concision. You're very concise, you're very precise when depicting a scene, and there's nothing missing and there's nothing extra there.
Thank you, first of all. May your praise of me never stop. I'm enjoying it hugely.
¿Cómo llegas a eso? Es la pregunta.
How can you do it? Is there a work process? Is it lengthy? Are you lazy or do you cut a lot?
I do cut. I think cutting is the most powerful tool the writer has, often, especially when so much of what they write is as bad as my first drafts. It's important always to see a draft as the starting process, the clay from which you will sculpt the masterpiece. Like Michelangelo would treat the block of stone. You can chip it away and maybe David will be lurking in there somewhere. That's the hope. So cutting is vitally important. But I think in a way, being concise, being tight, begins with good planning. So I'm quite a structured writer. I think quite technically. I wouldn't want to use the word workmanlike, but I try to treat it like work. It is quite workmanlike, frankly. A little banal at times. So I plan quite strictly, and I try, as you say, to make everything essential in the scene, and always to be asking the question, is this necessary? Is this helpful? And I suppose over time I've got a little better at that. In a way, when I came to write the Shattered Sea books, the starting point was not so much writing for a younger audience as to write something that was as tight and condensed as I possibly could, to see if I could write epic fantasy in a short space, if you like. And really there, the idea was for every page to have a kind of precision to it. There's a writer called Adam Neville, British horror writer, who, funnily enough, I met in Avilés the first year that I was here. This was 5 years ago. And he told me his philosophy of writing, which was you've got to have life and death on every page. That was a little bit too highbrow for me. So I kind of figured a slap in the face on every page was what I was going for. Something on every page that drags you forward, that is a powerful moment of character, that is a big laugh, that is a big shock, that is a moment that you really feel makes you want to read the next page. And so I guess over time I've tried to get better at that discipline of making every word count and every page count. Yeah.
Juan, go ahead. I have one question. He never shuts up, Joe, you know, so I just give up. I just look at him.
I'm good. I'm good.
Hay una pregunta.
Anyway, a question we all writers hate, which is, where do you get your ideas from? Are you going to ask him that, Juan? Every time someone asks that, God kills a kitten, and we'd like to kill the guy who asked. But it's true that in this case, Juan, do you get your questions from? You have spoken about the planning, about how structured you are, about the First Law trilogy. And I'd like you to tell us about the moment when you visualize this world for the first time, before you become a writer, how do you see this place, this England, this Union, this Turkish Empire? How does that grow in your head? How do you realize there's a story there you want to tell?
I mean, I think the first law was, as my first book really, and the first world I worked with, was something that grew up over a very long time, and the roots of it go right back into my childhood. Some of the characters had been with me in some form since I was, 11 or 12, and then over time, as I'd thought about them, as I'd thought about the world, they'd become more adult, and ideas I'd had and things I'd read and really liked or wanted to explore would kind of become bolted on. And so...
A los 11, 12 años...
11 or 12? You were already creating these characters when you were 11 or 12?
Yeah, I mean, I was a big role-playing gamer as a kid. I played a lot of Dungeons & Dragons. I know, I look too cool now. But I did play a lot of Dungeons & Dragons as a kid. I had all the dice, all the squared paper, different sizes, all the coloured pencils, the fibre-tip pens. I drew a lot of maps. And so a lot of the ideas, and, let's be honest, a lot of the ideas are quite generic. Mm-hmm. There's maybe not a magic tower, but a mysterious tall building. Maybe not a barbarian, but a kind of savage warrior person. So, I mean, a lot of the ideas aren't that original in essence. I think that's what makes the genre interesting. So, as I got older and I started to consider these ideas more, I guess I started to bring a bit more originality into them, or at least ideas that I'd stolen quite widely. I think that's as close to originality as I'd ever want to get. Original ideas are very dangerous. Who knows what will happen when you write down something that's never been written before. I prefer a nicely worn idea, well used, like a saddle that's been rubbed down over the years,
Eso es una cosa que Joe hace.
This is something you're very good at. And I'd like you to tell us more about that. You take general characters, basic traits, Gandalf-like characters or Conan characters. Probably Glotka is your most original character, an inquisitor, which is something that was not usually used. And you introduced them in the story in a way we had never read before. And this is something quite unique. How do you do that? How do you do that twist? How do you turn into something original, a basic material which was not original to begin with?
I'd like there to be an extremely impressive answer to that question that implies this was all part of an amazing master plan of mine to reinvent and reinvigorate the genre. Perhaps if I had a suede jacket with elbow pads, I could make that happen for you. I think it's very easy after you've written something, long after you've written something, 10 years, 15 years in this case, and you've heard people talk about it quite a lot, to mythologize a little bit. And when people say, clearly what he was going for was this, you think, oh yeah, that is what I was going for. Man, I'm really clever. But in fact, a lot of it was just simply what developed when I sat down to write. And so I wanted to write a classic fantasy story in many ways. I wanted to write my take on some of those very generic, very classic things, boys with a special destiny, a boy destined to be king, used up man of violence looking for a better life, a wizardly mentor with a mysterious agenda who turns out to be a really nice guy all along. Those kind of characters, I really wanted to use classics. I suppose I was always very impressed with westerns like Unforgiven or The Outlaw Josie Wales, revisionist westerns. I used to watch westerns as a kid, old westerns like High Noon, classic white hats, black hats. And then I was fascinated when I started seeing spaghetti westerns, the way that they seem to bring this gritty, filthy, morally squalid sensibility to this otherwise quite pure genre. And then it developed again to this slightly more realistic, mixed take that a film like Unforgiven has, where it is a great western, first and foremost, but it also has something to say about westerns. It's that, I think, was something that fascinated me, and that's kind of what I wanted to do with fantasy, and sort of the approach that developed. But really, with a character like Logan, I think I first started trying to write the book that would become The Blade itself when I was about 20. I had a go, because these ideas had been in my mind a long time, as I say. And I wrote very much the same scenes that were in the book at the end when it got published. Very similar scenes, pretty much the same actual action. But the voice and the tone and the approach and the feel of the characters was totally different. Much more hackneyed, much more unimaginative, even more unimaginative, you might say. It didn't have that kind of sideways look, that sense of humour, that interest in the voice, which for some reason just appeared when I started trying to write it again. I think I'd kind of grown up. I'd learned to take myself a bit less seriously. I'd been in the workplace. I'd seen a lot of ridiculous things. And I felt like I wanted to kind of strip away some of the pomposity and try and do something that had some wit to it. And so the voice that a character like Logan just seemed to have was something that developed quite quickly, and that almost straight away I found myself quite fascinated by. It seemed something almost external to me. And I was really excited by seeing where this went and how it would develop. And over time, those voices, as I wrote the scenes with those characters, they kind of distilled further and further. And certain things would seem to really work for a character, and certain things would become almost repeated catchphrases that would come to define that character. And so a lot of it was just what seemed to happen naturally as I wrote, and some things worked, some things didn't. I'd cut away what didn't, I'd focus on what did, and gradually develop this more and more pure concept of what a character's voice should be, until in the end I could kind of slip into them quite effortlessly, it felt like. So when I came to write the third book, say, I could get Glockter's voice, get the feel of how he'd respond to a situation very quickly. But it was always something I was really keen to do, to get right in the characters' heads, you know, and to write a book that was very experiential, if you like. A lot of the fantasy I'd read had this kind of floating, omniscient attitude to the characters. It would describe, it would dip into their thoughts, their very heroic thoughts often, or their very villainous thoughts, but it wouldn't be based in their experience of what was happening. And I really wanted to be with the characters. I think I'd read James Ellroy at this point, his LA Quartet, so thrillers set in LA, very different to fantasy, but he has this approach where he's rigidly locked in the head of the individual characters, the different points of view within the story. And every character, not only does their personality kind of suffuse the page when he's writing from their point of view, but even the vocabulary and the constructions suit the style of the person. So that was very much the approach I wanted to take right from the start. And it just seemed to work quite naturally that way.
Okay, I'm going to bring you to my specialty, if you want. There's something you don't often find in fantasy, which is the sense of humor, irony. I don't know if it's because writers fear that the sense of humor takes you away from the world you want to create. But sometimes I miss irony in fantasy, and I do find that in your books. How do you play with the tropes of fantasy and humor? How do you make your characters be ironic? Are you not afraid to lose fantasy? Are you not afraid to lose the reader in a way? They might feel that they're reading something which is fictional because of the joke you have just included. Are you not afraid? Siempre me da miedo. La verdad es que estoy aterrado.
I blame Tolkien, as I always try to do, for anything. In the sense that one thing that Tolkien really did was to write something very serious. Part of the joy of Tolkien is his kind of solemn, mythic tone. And in imitating that tone, and I think it's fair to say that Tolkien was no humorist. It's not what he was after. But in imitating that tone, a lot of the writers who came after Tolkien became more and more solemn and kind of self-regarding, and it had to be serious and weighty and important and terribly slow. And so you had that on one side, and on the other side you had a style of fantasy that became out-and-out satire and a joke, because, you know, something that's very solemn is very easy to take the mick out of, if you like. And so you had those two things, but there wasn't very much that seemed to have in it the kind of humour of real life, if you like. And I know what you mean about the risk that humour can make things, can kind of burst the bubble, make things seem silly. But I think actually, when something's done well, you know, I think of directors like Mike Leigh or playwrights like Alan Ayckbourn who do this very, very dark, bleak, black material. But it's also very funny. And there's no reason that wit and darkness can't inhabit the same space. In fact, the two, you know, often enhance each other. For one cannot have light without shadow, my child, you see. So I think it's important to try and have both. And always, right from the start, I think, again, it was something that happened quite naturally. It was just the feel the characters had. There was a certain wit to the way they talked, and I was always intent on trying to exaggerate that, make it more, and to bring in anything that seemed funny. Because when I read, what I really want to read is something that makes me laugh. I mean, I'm always love a book that makes me laugh. And I think often what makes a character vivid and fascinating and makes that voice of a character that you really react to strong is this sense of humour that they can have. And whenever I think about a character that I really love, that's made a strong impression on me, they're always a character who has some wit and lightness of touch about them. And so it's always something I've tried to include as much of as possible, although, you know, at times you've got to slightly rein in, perhaps, things that risk puncturing the bubble. But it's that sense of reader immersion is always such a difficult thing to judge, because every reader's different. And so where any joke might make one reader say, this is not what I look for in fantasy, I feel a bit peculiar now. I feel it in my waters, a strange sense. I think others will love something that's witty, and you've got to really write to your own taste and not worry too much about what any given theoretical reader might think, and just hope that some people will like what you do. If you try and file off all the rough edges, take away anything that's challenging or odd or strange, in the end you end up with something very bland. And it's better to be intense and frankly hated by a lot of people. A writer can make a great career being loved by the few and hated by the many, but you can't make much of a career on being treated with very little interest by anyone. So it's better to be intense for me.
Hay una...
There's a critique to be made of your books. Listen, Juan, this guy...
Are you sure? You're talking to him?
No. Él también escribe libros, básicamente.
He also writes books about a concept which is brothers-in-law. I'll let you know later. Brothers-in-law are these guys who know-it-alls, basically. You know? Cuñado, a brother-in-law. That's a critique to be made of your books. And when I say a critique, it's a critique, you know, between inverted commas, which is that all of the characters are extremely clever. They're all very intelligent. If I read the Sword for Hire, or the Barbarian, or the Inquisitor, or the Wizard, they all have one-liners, you know? One-liners which are just amazing, you know? Per page, the amount of one-liners per page, there's too many, really. I mean, I admire that. I underline your books. I take notes. There's 6 or 7 underlined lines per page when I read your books. But I'm also surprised that all of your characters in your universe are so very clever, so witty. And this is the only thing I'm going to critique. And the question is, how do you manage to condense so much wisdom? Because it is wisdom what you're delivering, so that all of your characters in your universe always have something interesting to say, which is not only valid for the scene at the moment, but also for life.
Well, if that's a criticism, I'll take more. It's a bit like when you go to a job interview and they say, what's your big weakness? And you say something like, sometimes I'm just too handsome. It really can upset the workplace balance. It's that kind of critique. Sometimes your one-liners are too good. I don't know, I mean, I think... I suppose I get a bit carried away with the dialogue. I generally start with dialogue, and I find dialogue relatively the easiest thing to write. So generally when I'm writing a scene, I'll construct it around the dialogue. I'll write the dialogue first, and then I'll fill in the other bits, and often it ends up with descriptive passages that need writing and that I kind of can't be bothered to do properly. Sometimes I'll just leave those all together for later, and then I end up with this pass at the end where I have to do loads of descriptive writing, and I find that quite hard work. So I kind of start with the dialogue, and I suppose the weird thing about characters is, in the end, they're all you, which is a slightly scary proposition in many ways. When you write a conversation, it's you talking to you. It's some kind of exaggerated aspect of yourself you're drawing on. So I suppose it's always me talking to me. I find it quite hard to edit that down. And I often, you know, I tend to cut away what I don't find interesting or exciting. And so you're left with as much that's good as I can fit in there. And I try to make, you know, I'm a bit prone to aphorisms. I don't know if that word means the same thing, a bit prone to pithy sayings and clever things. And I maybe do a little bit too much of that. You end up with a whole set of armchair philosophers talking to each other. But I like those kind of things. I like those kind of characters, so it's hard for me to avoid. And if you think of something that's good, the last thing you want to do is cut what's good. You want to cut what's bad, generally. That always amazes me with people's attitude to editors of books, is they always, you know, they blame the editor because the editor must have taken out all the good stuff. You know, editors try and take out the bad stuff, as do writers, and leave behind what's good. So, yeah, a fair criticism, I'm sure. Too many aphorisms. Just too clever. Too clever. It's hard.
You have thought about creating your own world. It cannot be comparable to Tolkien or to Martin. You created your own universe, your own characters, and all of a sudden you feel like, and there were elves here, you know, just out of the blue. When do you decide to break the reader's head in a way, you know? You have built a world where there are no elves, no dragons, no anything, and all of a sudden you mention elves. When do you decide to introduce such tropes of fantasy? Is that funny for you, doing that? Or do you want to make it funny for the reader?
I don't know. I mean, I try not to think too much about the reader. You know, writing would be a great job if it wasn't for them. And all the writing, obviously, is quite hard work as well. Otherwise, writing would be a great job. I mean, I think as a writer, you try and write for yourself. You've kind of got to. The moment you start writing for the potential audience and try to judge how will people take this, in a way, that's the moment when you lose touch with what's interesting about what you do, which is your own particular take on things. So it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to say when you fix on a certain idea, a certain way of doing a certain scene. Often it's instinctive. I mean, I plan quite carefully. I'll structure things quite carefully, and so I'll have ideas about how a certain scene will play out, about how a certain plot line will play out, and then it's in the writing that I kind of work out the nitty-gritty, I guess. But as far as the fantastical elements go, I suppose I was always more interested in what fantasy has in common with everything else than the things that make it different from other literature. So I try to keep the fantastical elements and the elves and the magic and the things of that kind relatively to the background, and relatively ill understood and ill known by the characters. So I'm not a big fan of high fantasy settings that sort of explode with strange magic and strange things. They can be brilliant. It's just not my particular bag, I suppose. And so I try to focus on the people and their own personal experiences and leave the fantasy more vague in the background, I guess. That's just, and in fact, as time's gone on, I've tended to include fewer and fewer fantastical elements and have things that are more and more mundane in a sense. I think in a way, talking about light and shadow earlier, I think the fantastical things stand out that bit more strongly against a background that's largely mundane, that's largely realistic, if you like. I think also, in trying to focus very much on the people, there's some distraction element in those fantastical elements, and I want, you know, to focus more on the people and keep them front of house.
Yo creo que es muy interesante.
I think it is very interesting to see how you have defined fantasy today. Those of us who grew up reading Tolkien, we realized that in the 70s, fantasy was something different than it is today. In the 70s, in the 80s, in the early 90s, fantasy meant something. If a modern reader reads the Dragonlance Chronicles today, finds it outdated. You know, it hasn't stood the passage of time that well. Modern fantasy, and I think the best writers in modern fantasy are yourself, Pat Rothfuss and George R. R. Martin, perhaps also Brandon Sanderson, even if I like him a little bit less. But I think that the four of you have something in common, which is that the four of you focus a lot in characters, in people, in what happens to them. But I think there's also a sense of maturity. Readers accept gritty details, blood, violence. There's a lot of darkness in your books, of grittiness in your books. Sex is quite natural as well. And this is done because you understand that the reader is not only 12 or 13 anymore. It is a grown-up reader who wants to read realistic stories which really show what the fantasy world could be.
Yeah, I suppose, like you, but it sounds like you, you know, I read Lord of the Rings as a kid, really, and became fascinated by fantasy, read an awful lot of fantasy in the 80s. And this was before the internet. There was a time before the internet. And so I wasn't part of fandom. I knew of nowhere to go to get recommendations for books. And so I didn't read a lot of the much more interesting, strange stuff that had always been there. I read what was at the front of the bookstore. And it was things like David Eddings and Dragonlance and Terry Brooks, you know. And I loved all those books and really enjoyed them. But I reached a point where I started to feel like I was going over the same ground a lot. And things were quite formulaic, were quite heroic. And when you saw the characters introduced at the start of the book, you had a pretty good idea how things were going to turn out. And I guess I just started to... There was no big moment of turning away from fantasy, but I started to become a bit impatient with seeing the same thing. And I obviously was reading other things, you know, westerns, classics, things like Dickens, some Russian literature, all kinds of different stuff, and seeing a lot of other ways to do things. And I guess I wondered, why is no one doing in fantasy something that is shocking and gritty and dark in the way that some of the thrillers or the westerns that I was reading were? And then I read Game of Thrones in the 90s. And obviously, I can remember being given the book, and it had this red cover with a big knight on the front, on a big war horse. I think there was a wizard on one side and maybe a dragon. And I was like,
Yeah.
I've seen this before. I know how this one turns out, you know, you needn't bother. But this friend who gave it to me said, you know, you should read this, because you used to love fantasy, didn't you? You should read this, give it a try, you'll find it interesting. And I was like, yeah, whatever, I know how this will go. The noble guy will save the kingdom, whatever. And of course, I found that quite a light bulb moment, because in Game of Thrones I found expressed a lot of things that I felt had been missing from the genre, or that I hadn't seen there before. The unpredictability and the shocking quality and the violence of it, the sort of realisticness of the violence, the darkness, but also that tight focus on characters that, you know, I was interested in. So that was a kind of big moment for me, and it made me realise you can do something that is very much core epic fantasy and has all the virtues that you want from that genre, but still do something shocking and interesting. And I think, you know, that was undoubtedly a big impulse in me, you know, wanting to write something darker, more character-focused, and with much greyer, much more unpredictable characters. And I guess, you know, I talked about Unforgiven as well. That was always a big influence on me in the way that film treats westerns and other similar films treat the western genre. I feel like when genres become very predictable and have a lot of patterns that are repeated, have a lot of tropes and cliches in them, it can become dull, but it's also a great opportunity, because it's as though readers expect a certain thing, and their expectations give you the opportunity to pull the rug out from under them and give them a shock in a way they could never otherwise have, like giving them, a can of Coke that has something other than Coke in it. Perhaps urine, in this case. It's such a shock when they think they know what they're getting and they get something very different. And so I've always been, interested in shocking readers, because as a reader, I like to be shocked. Some readers find that really unpleasant. I mean, not the can of Coke with the urine in it, that obviously would be very unpleasant, but just the general thing of being surprised. They don't like it. I love to be shocked. And so that's what I wanted to do with readers, to set up some classic things and then to really deliver some slightly different takes on them.
But nevertheless, as Juan was saying earlier, fantasy readers are more mature. They know all the tricks in the book. So it makes it harder for you to pull the rug from under their feet. In your second trilogy, you decide to write for YA. With the first law, you have the adult readers, and all of a sudden, you start with YA. Why do you do it? You think you're lowering the bar? You're setting the bar lower? What's the difference between writing a trilogy for adult readers and for younger readers? What do you change?
Well, I think the short answer is as little as you can. I wanted, I'd written 6 big adult fantasy books. They were in the same world. They were of roughly the same type. They had some characters and settings in common. And so I felt like I needed to try something different to kind of refresh myself, work in a different setting, invent a new world, work with some different styles of characters, but also work with a different structure, a more focused, tighter, more boiled down kind of structure. And I'd been approached about the possibility of writing some YA books a few years before by a young adult editor at HarperCollins in the UK. And he, like my adult books, had thought, I might have a good young adult book in me. So he'd suggested it to me, and the idea had sat in the back of my mind. And it seemed like a good opportunity to combine something focused at a slightly younger audience, perhaps, with a different world and a much more focused kind of take on epic fantasy, an attempt really to boil things down to their most fundamental few elements. So I guess it was more about trying to write something very tight and concise than it was about trying to simplify or to render less graphic, if you like. I suppose I started from the point of view that young adults are adults. The clue is in the title in many ways. They're just younger than old adults like me. And I thought back to what I read at 12 and 13 and 14, and what I liked to read then is basically the same thing I like to read now, substantially. Young adults they're facing big things in their lives for the first time. They're dealing with romance, they're dealing with big decisions, they're dealing with sex, with violence, with all kinds of, with politics. The last thing young adults want is something that treats them like children, that talks down to them, that doesn't treat these big issues honestly. They want something that's honest and truthful. And in my adult writing, what I'd always tried to do was to kind of be honest and to say what I really thought. And so it was the same with the young adult stuff. There'd have been no point in doing it if I wasn't taking a different tone of voice. And so the idea was to take a slightly more, it kind of has a Viking feel to it. So the idea was to take that slightly Viking saga, slightly more mythic tone, something that was a little less conversational in tone. And so naturally it doesn't have quite the same edge in terms of the explicitness of sex and violence in it. But I still wanted to cover that ground. I thought it was very important to. And so, in a sense, it was more an exercise in really reducing, boiling it down and trying to make every line important, to reduce the number of characters, to reduce the number of plot lines. But I suppose I treated it, the first law, for example, has 6 points of view, 6 point of view characters, and they're scattered throughout the book, and their plot lines cross and intersect, and they alternate with each other, and sometimes they're together, sometimes they split apart. So it's a big, complex book that covers a lot of ground. With Half a King, which was the first of these young adult books, there's one point of view. I wanted to experiment with literally writing a book that was all one character's story. The second book has two that alternate, and the third book then has three. They become different in each case. So the idea was just to write not a simpler book, but one that pulls out one thread and just focuses on that. So it was a kind of, to write something distilled. And to, I suppose because I'd always been interested, as I say, in this idea of how short and tight can you make epic fantasy and still feel epic. It was an exercise in that as much as anything. And it just seemed to suit the young adult market. Seemed to be an interesting way to perhaps bring in some new readers while keeping the existing readers at least relatively happy, which is what you always try to do. I think if I'd written something that was markedly different, if I'd gone for my romance set in a recruitment agency in Scotland, if I'd done that book, it might not have worked for my fans who like fantasy. Whereas this was, I suppose, the apple falling not too far from the tree, which I think is what you try to do with each book, to move things on a little, but not so much that you'll leave readers behind, perhaps slightly disgruntled in your wake.
Joe ha dicho una palabra muy fea.
You've said a very dirty word earlier, which is politics. You said politics. That's a very dirty, dirty word, you naughty boy. But it's true that in fantasy, this doesn't show up often. If you read Tolkien, basically there's loads of free people, and then there's the evil forces, the great enemy. This has been the cornerstone for fantasy for decades. And if there were differences between political parties, or between elves and dwarves, they were fixed by using a hammer, a blow to the head, and that was it. That was politics for Tolkien, a blow to the head, that's it. But the first writer to introduce politics is George R.R. Martin. But you introduce politics as a key element in your story. You don't really care about the enemy when you're reading Game of Thrones, Song of Fire and Ice. You know how you have the zombies, the living dead. You know they're going to show up at a certain point and the rest is just secondary. But in your case, you're really focused on politics. I'm not going to spoil anything if any of you have not read any of the books, but in your First Lord trilogy, in the rest of the standalone books, and in the Shattered Sea, politics are a key element. Why do you take that decision? Why do you take the decision to introduce politics as the cornerstone?
Took a while to come through that time. Well, I think, again, a lot of it was instinctive. It was kind of just what interested me in a lot of the time. As you say, there was a lot of fantasy that was very much, here is a dark lord who is dark and evil in a way that is hard to relate to as a human. They're not a human enemy, you know. I guess we're used these days to thinking of enemies, political enemies, as people with their own agenda, people with their own ideas. You don't think people are evil for the sake of it. You think they have a different way of looking at the world. People think they're doing the right thing. They do bad things for good reasons, generally. Rarely does someone say, I'm going to do something really evil today. So I kind of wanted the villains, if you like, the antagonists of the story, to feel like there was some reason for what they did. And I guess that meant becoming a little bit political. I'd read a lot of history. I read a lot of non-fiction. Most of what I read these days is non-fiction. And I suppose I'd just naturally got into this habit of thinking about both sides of a question. So with the heroes particularly, say, I mean, that book's the story of a single battle, but I very much wanted to cover both sides, and for there not to be a right side and a wrong side, but just all kinds of different people with different motives, different ways of looking at the world caught up in these grand events. That's the sort of story that's always interested me. I suppose, in a sense, the first law is a story where the main characters are the villains, without wanting to spoil too much. They're both the heroes and the villains, if you like. Those are the kind of stories that I like.
And money. Money is also very important in your stories. Money has... and we're not going to say anything.
That was the thing I was just about to say as well, that economics was, you know, something that I was really interested in looking at, because Tolkien, again, there's not a lot of money in Middle-earth. I think maybe Gandalf, does he pay for a pint at the Prancing Pony, something like that. But otherwise, it doesn't come up a lot, you know. Saruman doesn't spend on the walls of Orthanc, and Gondor doesn't have to pay its soldiers. There's not a lot of notion of how the economy of Middle-earth works. How does Sauron feed the orcs? Because it's all a blasted valley, isn't it, Mordor? Imagine if you blasted it all, then thought, oh no, how am I going to grow anything now? That'd be embarrassing. So I was kind of interested in looking at the economics, because in the real world, it's not evil and good that cause wars. It's economic changes, it's tectonic shifts in the nature of culture, it's development and growth of society. Fantasy often has these almost sandbox worlds in which nothing ever really changes. You know, the sense of Middle-earth is that it's been this way for thousands of years, that it's eternal in a sense. Lord of the Rings is the story of the end of that kind of pastoral idyll, if you like. But there's not often, you don't have a sense of a growing, developing, changing world. Our world, of course, has been constantly in flux, constantly changing in technology, in industry. And I wanted some sense of these kind of forces of cultural change, of economics and of society shifting and creating, you know, political trouble, creating unrest, creating upheaval. So some fantastical elements, definitely, there on the periphery, but also some elements that we'd recognise as being the kind of thing that cause conflict in our world. And that, to me, makes for a more compelling story, one that feels like it takes place in a place that we recognise and can understand.
I see a lack in you, Joe. There's something missing. So you can ditch him. You know, you can badmouth him. You know, you start praising him, but I'm going to hit him hard. That's me. I'm the bad cop. I see there's something missing. I see we have the best possible Joe Abercrombie. He's showered.
Ya, lo que tenemos aquí pues es un premio.
No, what I have with us is candy for the eyes. It's eye candy. But anyway,
Todos sabemos por las novelas de Stephen King que.
So as I was saying, writers are alone, and they can be crazy. We found out that through Stephen King. You have a high degree of mania, and you have a very fast pace writing, so you probably spend a lot of time writing in the creative process. I'm sure all of the writers have manias. You know, for example, Juan tends to rub candy against his chest when he's writing. Don't read his books, and yeah, that's what he does. You know, he rubs it on his chest. It's really unpleasant. I changed now. It's not candy anymore. It's sort of donuts. You know, his chest.
What a process.
¿Cuál?
So, which one is yours? I'm not going to ask about your quirk, but what's your obsession? What's your crazy thing? When do you go like, okay, I have to stop for a while because I'm going nuts, because the story has eaten me up and it's eating my mind. And I know this happens with writers who do not deny it.
No, I would never dream of denying it. I think, you know, the act of deciding to spend 3 years producing something that might never be of interest to anyone is by itself kind of mad, because most writers don't have a contract when they first start writing. They do it because they feel compelled to do it, because they decide to try it and then become gripped by it. And so you've got to be obsessive, driven, I suppose ambitious for your writing. And for me, I often think of there being a kind of yin and yang of the writerly persona, or of the successful writer. On the one hand, you've got to have this manic, insane arrogance, egotistical madness to suppose that anyone might be interested in what you have to say, let alone thousands of people. To sit there and say, I'm going to say something so funny that thousands of people will want to give me their money. What an act of appalling arrogance and ego that is. On the other hand, you've also got to be this pathetic little victim who doubts everything that you do, because if it's all ego, what you'll write will just be self-indulgent shite, frankly. But if it's all self-doubt, you'll never get past the first page. So the ego and the desire to kind of produce has got to be balanced by this doubt that makes you want to improve and refine and revise and work on what's there. Because generally, what's there the first time round is bad. And writing becomes good, at least for me, through a process of kind of not endless, but nearly endless, constant refinement and working over editing, revision. So those two things in constant conflict, never quite in balance, make for quite an ugly home life, frankly. So good for the writer, good for the writing, not so great for the people who are around the writer often, I think, because I know that I become obsessive about things in the planning and in the editing phase. Start and end of a job, start and end of a book. That's where I feel really switched on and excited. The possibility of the planning part, all these great things that are to come. It's going to be brilliant. It's going to be wonderful, Mum. The editing part, it's now done. I can refine, I can improve, I can review, I can take that junk that I've written and file it down to a wonderful point of sharpness, and I can see it become a proper work. The bit in between, the writing part, that's where I really have problems. So usually the first fifth or quarter of a book, I'll write quite happily, sort of like when Wile E. Coyote runs off the end of the cliff and is still in midair. About a quarter of the way through, I'll start thinking, this book is terrible. This book is not only the worst book I've written, it's the worst book that's ever been written. This is the one that's going to end my career. You know, everyone will despise me after this one. And then you've got to push through that phase, I find I have, and then gradually as you get towards the end, you start thinking, I actually know what I'm doing with this book. I know what this book's about. I'm starting to see how to fix it. And so I have that very self-doubting, unself-confident period when I'm writing a book, but I very much enjoy the process of start and end. So start and end, I'm head down working for 7, 8 hours a day straight sometimes, especially when I'm editing. I can just read and go over and revise and review for hours at a time. But the actual writing part, I'm usually driving myself to the keyboard and really forcing myself to grind out the words. And I think in a way, that's sort of what separates the professional from the hobbyist in the end, is that you've just got to grind the words out even when it feels like the words are horrible, even when it feels like the book is horrible. Because it's better to work for a day and produce a load of rubbish than to work for a day and produce nothing, because you might trawl through the rubbish later and find there's a few diamonds hidden away inside. What's on the paper? Fascinated now.
Cuenta que.
Aquí dice, das paso.
It says, open the floor for the audience.
En cuanto yo te diga una...
Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to give them the floor, but they gave you a note. Juan, come on. Come on, you cannot just ignore that. It's being Perruca who gave it to you. It's Andres. You know, he's paying for this. Come on, pay attention to the guy. No, but I need something, says Juan. You were talking about the fight between ego and self-doubt. But there's another struggle for writers, I find, which is how much we hate writing, because I don't know any writer who doesn't hate writing more than anything else, and deadlines. You know, that's another struggle. I need you to tell me something. How many words do you write a day?
It varies. It used to be 2,000.
2,000? Hot.
Once upon a time. When I was just getting started, I think my third book, when my trilogy was set up and running, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. I knew exactly the voices of the characters. I could do 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 words even in a day, relatively easily. And writing was still new and exciting. I'd only just been published, so, you know. Over time, that number has dwindled. Now I aim for 6,000 a week when I'm writing new stuff, when I'm drafting. But I'm only drafting maybe half the time, because I'll be planning, and then obviously there's no particular word count on that. I just say, I'm happy with what I've done today, maybe, when I've written some stuff that I like. Looks good on the page, nicely organised, nice pen, right colour ink, that kind of thing. That's progress.
Y la segunda parte es...
Second question. Remember the note. Remember the note. But it's important that before we give the floor to the audience, you, Joe, tell us what's your next book about. What are you working on? What are you writing 6,000 words a week on right now? What universe?
I'm back in the first law world now. Why? No one else is cheering? What? Thank you. Thank you.
Bravo.
It's good. It's good. That's good. But you're so eager. The eager audience is nice. I'm back in the first law world. I promised to write 4 books, and Red Country was the first. And I signed a deal to write 4 books.
Mi favorito.
Your favorite?
That's my favorite.
Nice. So I signed a deal for 4, and I delivered 1, and then I spent the money, and then I went away to write something else. And that, I believe, is frowned upon in publishing. I have some, yeah, we won't say anything. So now I need to come back and deliver those books that I said I'd do. And so I'm writing those now. And I'm about a third of the way through the first of another trilogy in the first law world, basically. Which moves things forward a little in time, as I try to do. It ties in a bit more closely to the first 3 books than the standalone ones in the same world have. And I guess it has a kind of a sense of coming industrialization, which has already been there slightly. I've always been fascinated by industrialization and kind of those forces of technology and change and economics growing to be a very important part of society. So it covers the sort of upheaval caused by industrialization, I suppose. That's the easy way to put it.
Juan, se me ha ocurrido que...
Juan, maybe this is a good time to give the floor to the audience. No lo entiendo.
Vale.
Ah, yeah.
Now, I will give you the floor. We have to thank Espacio Fundación Telefónica and Celsius232 because they're the ones responsible to have Joe here, and they're the guilty parties. They're the ones who brought us here. And now you have the floor. Joe, I guess you'll answer, right, when they ask. Do you have any question?
To go to the pub. Perfect.
A ver, por aquí tenemos una persona.
Now someone wants to ask over there. There's another one on the back. There's a girl. Yeah. We have someone here.
I'll try to ask you in English.
Nice.
If you don't mind.
No, I don't. It's a lot better than my Spanish.
Okay. You said before that you started imagining the first law when you were a child. And I find it amazing because every time I've been developing the same story for a long time, I always end up bored, completely bored. So my question is, how do you manage to maintain your passion for in a long planning period of time? How do you manage to?
Yeah, I suppose I had these basic scenes, these starts for some of the characters in mind, and I tried to write them before when I was maybe 20, and they'd been in mind a long time, and they'd developed and changed and shifted. And when I actually tried to sit down and write them in my 20s, or about age 20 after finishing university, they just were quite dry and pompous and had very little voice or excitement to them, it felt to me. So I wasn't massively keen to continue doing it. When I came back to trying it again, aged about 28, and I should say, I was working as an editor in TV. I was doing documentaries and live music, and I was freelance, so I had a lot of time off in between jobs, and that's really why I started writing, because I had this time off. And I felt, I've played as many computer games as I reasonably can now in this time off. I need something at least a little more valuable to do, so I will write this fantasy epic. And so, having sat down to write it, it just straight away had this tone and this different voice that I found really interesting, and that seemed to be, uniquely me in a way. That's an awful way to put it. Uniquely me. Sounds like a romantic comedy, doesn't it? Jennifer Aniston in Uniquely Me. Anyway, it had this tone of voice that I just found fascinating. And so I really enjoyed the writing of it, I suppose. And having written maybe 8 or 9 chapters and revised them and gone over them a lot, and I was literally at this point, I'd write a line, I'd revise it. I'd write another sentence, I'd revise that. I'd revise the paragraph. And I'd look at the paragraph I wrote yesterday, I'd revise that. And I guess I became fascinated by the technicalities of how you go about writing a scene. Because I'd been a picture editor, a video editor, TV, I knew a bit about how you'd structure a scene visually. You know, there are certain rules you follow and that sometimes you'll break in how you introduce a scene, how you structure the action within it. You start on a wide, you go closer, you pick up a character, you pick up the action. And I started to experiment with how to construct a scene, how to write what, when to describe, when to go into the character's head, when to do dialogue, when to split dialogue up with reaction. How could you structure things most effectively? And I suppose I just got really excited and interested in that technical challenge of how do you make this work? How do you make it interesting? How do you pace it? I'm kind of a details guy, I guess, so I was always fascinated by the details. What happens if you split a bit of dialogue with a bit of description? What happens if you make it a different kind of description? What happens if you group things? When do certain details of a scene become important? The fascinating thing about writing for me, as distinct from video, is that if you're going to shoot a scene, it's all got to be there. You've got to make the room, you've got to dress the actors, you've got to dress the set, you've got to have props. It's all got to be there, it's all got to look right. When you write, you're free to only fix on certain details, certain things that are germane, that are important, that tell the reader something about the character or about the place. And so I was just fascinated by the technical exercise of writing, I suppose. And after I'd written 8 or 9 chapters and was kind of starting to be happy with them, I showed them to my mum. And my mum is... They say, never trust your family's opinion because they love you, they're too soft on you, they're too easy on you. My mum is brutal. She's savage. She's the most brutal critic. You're lucky to have a brutal mother. Because my mum was an English teacher and a publisher for a while of educational books, and so she knew a lot about, she knew a lot about writing, and she steered my reading for many years. And so when I showed her some of it, and my dad too, she kind of said, this is actually not nearly as bad as I thought it'd be. And I knew then I must be onto something. And so I just started to become fascinated by her opinion about it, because she then had a set of opinions about what works, what doesn't work, how I could change things, what I could do differently. And so I became fascinated by discussing it with them. And in a way, it became a sort of group exercise. I'd write a few chapters, I'd give them to them, I'd hear what they had to say. And I'd think again about how to change things, how to move things around. And then, after a while, maybe 3 years, reached the point where I had a book. And I suppose I was just never reached that point of thinking, I hate this now, I'm going to do something else. It was always this thing. And I'd never really, for 20 years, as I say, I'd had this idea in my mind. I'd never really had another idea that I felt like I wanted to do. I felt like maybe someday I'd try and write a book, and it'd be this. And it was that. So I don't know. I'd love to say, I saw the peak like a mountain climber, and I meant for the peak, and I would not be deterred by anything. But frankly, I just did whatever seemed easy at any given moment. I just enjoyed doing it in the end. I don't enjoy it now, obviously. Sadly, when it becomes work, it does change, your attitude to writing. And the other thing is, you have that one thing you want to write. So I had that trilogy I wanted to write. The idea of reaching the end of one book, let alone 3, never occurred to me. And then I was writing the 3rd book, and my editor said, so what are you doing next? Oh my God. Never occurred to me there would be a next. And then, of course, when you come to the next thing, it's very different from that thing you always had in mind. Now it's a new thing. It's something that's made to measure. It's something, an idea you work up out of nothing. That was a really difficult moment writing my 4th book, because it was a new thing. Much harder to keep the excitement levels. None of that was any use to you at all, but you never know what you're going to get.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Someone else wanted to ask?
also.
Espera, si vais a preguntar todos en inglés, me voy a poner esto.
Are you going to ask in English? I don't mind about what Joe said, but I'd really like to understand your questions. I don't understand English. I pretend it all the time. If at all possible, speak in Spanish. I was really looking forward to wearing the headphones. Anyway, most science fiction genre writers talk about talking. If it were not by talking, you would not be tired of reading the same tropes, and you wouldn't have written. Had talking not existed, would you have written the kind of fantasy you write? Without talking, and your mother, would you have not written the kind of fantasy you write?
It's a hard question to ask. I mean, it's always very hard to say if you pulled one thing out of the kind of tapestry of influences that you have, how would it change things? I'm very influenced by Unforgiven, as I say, so if I'd never seen Unforgiven, how might that have changed things? There'd certainly be things I might do slightly differently. But Tolkien is so foundational for epic fantasy that it's very hard to imagine that whole genre without him. Everyone since is kind of in conversation with Tolkien, whether they like it or not. I mean, especially since the films are obviously such a huge thing. I mean, he was a massive influence as books on a whole generation of writers, of course, and continues to be. But then the films happened, obviously, and that then became its own kind of ongoing influence on a whole new generation and on the generation before. Because for me now, even though I read the books every year for 5 or 6 years as a kid, I can't now remember how they looked to me in my mind. It's just Viggo Mortensen. All the way. Viggo all day now. Sadly. And Ian McKellen. And, you know, I can't get rid of Peter Jackson's version of Lord of the Rings. So I think that's been a huge influence as well. So would there be epic fantasy of that kind without Tolkien? I don't know if there would. There wouldn't be those, you know, classic strong tropes like the wizard, you know, the wizardly mentor who's a bit gruff and a bit irascible, doesn't tell you everything, but has the best interests of the world at heart. If Gandalf wasn't there to be imitated, I mean, you still have Merlin, you know, you still maybe have Obi-Wan Kenobi. So these are bigger than just Tolkien, some of these things. But would they be as strong? Would they work as well to riff off? I don't know. So it's very hard to say. I mean, without Tolkien, perhaps there's no genre of commercial epic fantasy. Maybe now I'd be writing something else. That romance that takes place in the recruiting office. In Madrid, maybe. I don't know. Yeah. So who can say?
Yes, one.
What were you saying, Juan? You were talking about the movies, the Lord of the Rings movies. What can you tell us about possible adaptations of the Shattered Sea and the First Lord trilogy?
I can tell you about the Shattered Sea. I had a deal. It was a lovely deal. So long ago now. I had a deal for the Shattered Sea and to do it as movies, and I wasn't entirely convinced by this deal, but it kept getting bigger. The less convinced I was, the bigger it got. And then they asked me if I'd like to write a first script for it, and then it became big enough that I just couldn't really say no, and it was such a good opportunity to kind of have a go at script writing. So I wrote a script. It was a lovely script. And meanwhile, the deal was being made. The deal, you probably don't know, you might know, but these deals, film and TV deals, are of spectacular complexity. And they take ages to do. So the deal for this took a year, just to work out the deal. And by the time it got about 10 months in, I was ready to do the script. My schedule had opened up. I had the window to do it, so I did it. Wrote the script, sent it to them. The deal was then done and finalised. They read over it, made some very good comments, very interesting comments from the producers. You know, not comments like, how about if he has two hands, or anything like that, which is what I was expecting. They were decent, proper, interesting comments that I should have thought of when I wrote the book, frankly. Yeah. So I made a round of changes to the script. It was an even better script than it had been, if I do say so myself. And I sent it back to them. My agent said, better wait till, we've got everything signed. He phoned them up to ask if the signed contract's available. It was taking a while. They'd laid everyone off that morning, gone out of business, lost with all hands, sunk beneath the waves. I still have the script. If anyone has a couple $100 million on them now, we could get into production probably quite quickly. No one has a couple $100 million. So that was the story of the Chat-See. The lucky thing is, had the deal been signed, it would all be tied up in their mess of the studio's bankruptcy. As it is, I still own the script, and I could maybe sell that script at a later date, should I be able to. So that's a story of woe and horror. There is another story, but that shall not be told quite yet.
Creo que por aquí, sí, había alguien.
Someone else over there? I don't have any money with me, I changed jeans. He's got loads of money. I'm filthy rich. He always pays. It's insulting the amount of money I have. I don't like to be a show-off. I could brag and pay the film, but, I changed the trousers and I really love your characters and how you develop them. The character building. And you build characters like Logan or Monza's brother, who is dead, basically, in the beginning of the book, and you still develop him as a character. How?
¿Por qué?
And why?
Well, I think in terms of the why, characters are the heart of any book. In the end, if a story has uninteresting characters, regardless of the explosions and the plotting and the description and everything else that makes a good book, if the characters are bad, the book will always be bad. With film, I think it's a different story. You can get away with it if there's things that are dazzling to the eye. Even still, though, character is the absolute heart of storytelling. And so, for me, if I'm working on a book, the first thing, and in a way the only thing that is really important, is to get the characters right. Because if the characters are right, the rest will follow quite naturally. Because the corollary of however good other things are, if the characters are bad, it's bad. In a sense, the story of a fascinating character doing not a lot is still fascinating quite often. So getting the characters right, absolutely key. How do you do it? I wish I knew, because then I could do it very easily. And in fact, it's the thing that is eternally difficult to do. And it's the thing that sadly has an element of magic to it, if you like. I try to not be mystical about writing. I think that people can, talk about writing as art, talk about writing as inspiration, talk about writing as some kind of semi-magical thing that the little people cannot understand. And I don't think that's helpful. I think that just encourages you to not think of it as what it is, which is work. And in the end, it's about work. But when it comes to making a character work, there is just this element of magic, that you can plan a book carefully, you can think about what a book's going to be, you can know who a character is, what their background is, what they look like, you can kind of have good ideas how they think, the role they'll play in the story, how you need them to be. And yet, it's not until you start writing from their point of view, or you start writing their dialogue, their thought. Sometimes it just works. Sometimes it works instantaneously. For me, a lot of the more minor characters in my books, characters like the Dogman, or like friendly characters that are there to kind of break up and have quite small roles often, but are very vivid voices, they often just work effortlessly for some reason, and they're just there instantly. So the Dogman's chaps, I barely even had to edit, because I wanted that roughness to the way that the language was. And so sometimes they just work. Other times, they just don't. They just don't have that magic somehow. And Mons is a good example. She just didn't work at all initially. It took quite the whole book, really, for me to start feeling like I knew what that character was about and what was the key element of that character. And actually, it was a real exercise in cutting, because I reached the end of the book, and by the time I got to the end, having been really worried and having a lot of doubts while I was writing that book, I got to the end and thought, okay, I kind of know what I need this character to be now. And then it was a case of going back and really cutting away everything that didn't fit, adding a few things that did, and kind of changing the direction of the character, making her far more hard-headed, far more kind of ruthless. And so often it's not till you get to the end of a book that you really know what a character needs to be and you become comfortable with their voice. But still, sometimes they just work straight away, and sometimes they never quite get there for all your effort and work and thought, while some just work. So what's the answer? I don't know what the answer is. I wish I did. Sometimes they just work. I mean, I think, you know, we were talking about my mum earlier. You weren't, I was. She's never far from my thoughts, as any good boy should always be thinking of his mother, you know. And my mum's best piece of advice, and the best piece of advice I've ever had about writing, really, was you've got to be honest. You've got to be truthful with everything and in every way you can. So I'd used some trite metaphor. The sky was a sable cloth, with the stars as diamonds scattered upon it, something like that. The sea was like sparkling silver under the moon, something obvious and cliche. And she said, is this true? Does the sky look like a sable cloth? No. So when you write that metaphor, as soon as you introduce that element of falseness, where you think to yourself, is this true? It's not really true. As soon as it's false, it kind of jogs the reader a little bit. The reader feels, I'm not sure I believe this. And the more often that happens, the worse becomes that sense of not being involved. And it's a very fine line between feeling involved and then feeling, I don't really quite believe this anymore. And so you've got to ruthlessly try and pare away everything that seems false. And I think that's, applies to character as well. It applies to thought, it applies to dialogue. When you write a line of dialogue, you think, would someone really say, "Prithee, mine liege lord, the orcs approacheth from the eastern sky." People don't talk like that. So write something that seems true and believable. And so, again, that makes it feel real. And so that's one way to kind of get into a character, make it feel as true and real as you possibly can. And I suppose right from the heart a little bit. You might not know what it's like to be stabbed with a sword, but you know what stubbing your toe is like. So, think about stubbing your toe times 10,000 and extrapolate and try and get some honesty in there. Or lie convincingly. That's another option.
¿Hay alguna pregunta?
Any further question? Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Very nice to meet you. So we opened Pandora's box about the creative process. I'd like to talk to you about the creative process for battles. One of the key features for me of your work is how using different viewpoints from ancillary characters, characters which are basically disposable in a way, you can depict the whole of the battle. But you never give us the big scene, the wide shot. You use close-ups in a way. How do you think about using this kind of depiction of, how did you think of describing battles like that? And how is the process to describe everything? How do you make it so that everyone understands what's going on?
Yeah, big question. So you're talking about the heroes, I think, chiefly. So The Heroes is a book that covers a single battle for anyone who's not read it. You really should read it, it's very good. Or at least buy it. It covers a single battle, and it covers a lot of characters that are caught up in this battle. And in some sequences, I just cover like little extras, if you like, who are just people within the battle. And I think, I'm not sure exactly how I hit on that particular method. I just thought it would be cool to try. Because a battle is such a massive event, I thought it would be interesting to just get into the heads of some people very quickly and just get this little flashbulb impression of a person. and that I could take up a point of view. I sometimes think of my characters as cameras on the action. And when I was writing the first law, I have 6 points of view. I think of them as 6 characters. I think, what's going on in the world? What do I need to see? How will I get one of my cameras onto there? Or better still, 2 or 3 that can give me different viewpoints on what's happening. And so with those sequences, I was thinking, here's a battle. There's a massive load of stuff going on. I can pick up these little individual points of view and cover the ebb and flow of what's happening. The first thing I did was I sort of designed the battle quite scrupulously. So I said earlier that I read a lot of history. I read a lot of military history, particularly. And so I was always fascinated by the difference between the way that warfare is often presented in fantasy, this kind of shiny, heroic emphasis on the heroism and the success and the bravery and the glorious planning. Reading about real warfare, it's kind of chaos and randomness and just as much about failure and disaster as it is about glorious success, you know. So I wanted the battle to have this chaotic, mad sense to it. And I'd read a lot about the big battles of, say, the American Civil War, where you have an awful lot of people involved, a big battlefield with different areas and kind of different terrain, very varied, maybe over several days with different weather conditions. So I wanted the battle to be very varied. And in that particular case, I think it's a sort of, it's an attack. There's some soldiers on the battlefield already, but they're turning up in big numbers on that day. And so there's this first kind of big encounter. One side arrives on the battlefield, then the other side arrives, kind of charges. There's an engagement, and one side are driven back. And so it just seemed like it would fit very nicely to alternate between the two sides and to pick out these individual voices. And then it just felt like it would be kind of interesting if each one is killed and then you pick up the one who killed them. And I could kind of see it visually how it would work, you know, on film. As you say, I wanted it to feel like it was close-ups, not the big view of the battle, because that sense of the huge, the wide shot was one thing I don't necessarily like about fantasy, that it's all seen from a distance and it's about the huge and the vast. I wanted it to be about the people and the close-ups. I wanted it to feel, you know, the warfare to have that crunching sense of the horror of being right caught in the midst of it. And so it just felt like a good mechanism to try. And then I tried a similar thing that followed an order from the different hands that the order goes through. I was fascinated by the charge of the Light Brigade, which kind of happened because of all these mistakes that piled up one on another and these wrinkles of personality that flowed out through the kind of chaos of the battle to have these profound effects. So with the charge of the Light Brigade, the different people in the chain of command all hated each other, and it made them behave in this really bizarre way that normally would never have happened. And so an order that was passed down went awry and caused this terrible disaster. And so I was interested in doing something similar to that. An order passes through different hands and it kind of picks up the different points of view as it goes from one officer to another, down to a messenger who then gets intercepted and captured by enemies. And so I kind of wanted to use this jumping point of view to investigate the nature of what a battle's like and how it works and how it can be so chaotic and how heroism is, in a way, an afterthought often on top of this chaos and madness. Does that answer the question? Not sure it does, but I tried.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Any further question? Hi Joe, I'd like to ask you about 2 characters, Gabi in the Shattered Sea and Bias in the First Law.
Ligeramente, bueno.
These are 2 very Machiavellian characters. They carry out their plans. They don't care who falls and who stands. They don't mind about, you know, possible victims of what they do. Do you think that's something that happens in reality as well? That those who might be successful, those who really lust for power, just like Yavi and Bayas have the lust of power, are the ones who are actually successful in life.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You used Machiavellian, and Machiavelli's The Prince is like a foundational text for me in how I live my life, as well as writing fiction. And I was fascinated by Machiavelli's The Prince and kind of the way he presents ruthlessness, not only as what's necessary, but almost as a good, because this is what's required in order to keep structure, to keep shape to society. These are the hard choices that are necessary. And so it's such a different concept of what power is to what you often see in fantasy, where power, you know, a good king is a good guy. You know, Aragorn is not a bad guy. Aragorn doesn't really have to make difficult decisions. He might have to make, you know, tough decisions. He might have to put people in harm's way. He might have doubts. But he doesn't have to make decisions about the greater good or expediency. The greater good is always clear. You resist Sauron. That is what is good in Middle-earth. You give in to Sauron, that's what's evil. So it's simple for him. Whereas Machiavelli shows you such a different side to power and politics. It's unrecognisable, really. And I suppose that kind of rings true a little bit to me. I mean, it may be that during the Cold War, you know, the idea of a right side and a wrong side, and in the shadow of the Second World War, obviously, that idea of a good side and a bad side, and we're on the good side, felt like it reflected reality in a way that maybe it doesn't so much now. We're used to seeing the world as a much shadier place, where power is a question of bargaining and compromise, and it's necessary to do bad things, like Jack Bauer in 24. Sometimes you've got to do bad things. And so I suppose I was interested in those characters who are tackling that question. I mean, Yavi's struggling with it a lot more than Bayaz is. I suppose Yavi's like a young Bayaz, if you will. Young Bayaz, there's a series for you. Bayaz is fully developed. He's kind of... I suppose with Bayaz, my thoughts were, what if Gandalf wasn't actually that nice? You know, what if you're an orc? Gandalf seems like a pretty terrifying guy. Here is a guy who has no doubts that you must be destroyed utterly. You know, he'll do whatever's necessary. He'll subvert the structures of power. He'll bring in some geezer from God knows where and claim he's the king. He'll do whatever's necessary in order to destroy the orc. If you're an orc, Gandalf's scary because he has no doubts. And so I kind of thought, you know, what if the wizard's not a good guy? And that was kind of where Bayaz came from. With Yavi, it was more, he starts off as a young kid who, you know, doesn't have what it takes to be a man, as a man is seen in this society. There's a certain role for men, and it's being manly, and it's having both your hands. Because he only has one hand, he can't hold a shield in the shield wall, and he can't, you know, be the manly epitome that's expected. And so he has to do things a different way. He has to use his cunning, he has to use his wits, and he has to make some quite dark compromises in order to really run things. And I suppose it's a question of how far before the greater good becomes the lesser evil, if you like. You know, where's the line? And he eventually can't tell where the line is. And I find that kind of character, for me, much more interesting than the guy who isn't faced with the hard choices. It's interesting because I was asked this question a little bit about Game of Thrones, about how there's very grey characters in Game of Thrones, whereas there's very black and white characters in Tolkien. I'm actually not sure that's true, because Eddard is a good guy. He's a guy with principle. But actually, he's just faced with very hard choices. Game of Thrones doesn't give the characters easy choices. So Eddard is like, he's a very white guy, actually, I think, but in a very grey world where he's never sure what the right thing to do is, and he's faced with all these horrible compromises and dilemmas that he has to make, where the right choice is never clear. Whereas Lord of the Rings and a lot of classic fantasy is much simpler. You know what the right choice is. And so I think, in a way, that's the difference. It's not so much grey characters, it's the grey world, the morally ambiguous world. And I'm interested in these characters trying to find a way through this moral maze, trying to decide what is necessary, what is right, and the answer's not easy. I just find those people fascinating.
Pues creo que...
Well, I think this is it. We've run out of time. Maybe one last question, but this is the last one. Over there. Hi. My question is kind of a stupid question, but which was your favorite Dungeons and Dragons character of those that you played? What did you play as?
My favorite Dungeons and Dragons character?
Bravo. Dumb question, you are right. You know, we end on a high note.
My favorite Dungeons and Dragons character, that sounds like an essay that I would have written age 9, doesn't it? Which is pretty much what I've been doing for the last 10 years, in many ways. I enjoyed games mastering. I was a terrible player. Terrible. I'd just roll the dice. I'd turn up and I'd roll the dice. And I'd have this trick that I'd do, because everyone used to sit on the floor, and I'd sit on the chair with my book and my character sheet, and have all my dice. And I'd arrange the dice in the throw I wanted. And then I'd throw some other dice, and then make the sound, cluckety-cluck, of dice, and then I'd show them the book. Oh, look, 99. That was my approach to being a player. I was kind of a statistics guy. I'd never do personality. My character would have no personality. I'd always get 0 experience for role-playing, which is disappointing. But as a games master, I was far better. And I got much more into the NPCs and doing the voices and all that stuff. Oh, I'm an old man. There is a cave over to the north. That kind of thing. I was very into that. And so I think, in a way, the games mastering and the designing of adventures, because, you know, games mastering is about creating the illusion that the characters can do whatever they want, when really you just want to push them into certain situations that you find interesting. And so the next step from games mastering is taking complete control of all the characters, and then you can make them do anything you like. And so I guess it was a natural movement from... But, you know, a lot of the characters that I've introduced as a games master have sort of found their way through some weird alchemy into my books in one place or another. So they're kind of personalities who have been around. Yeah, Koska is sort of spun out of a character that I had as an NPC long ago. Good times. Oh, 99.
Bueno, yo creo que lo vamos a dejar aquí en esta...
Okay, this is it. This was the last question, because we are talking about your characters, and then we're going to ask whether you like Spanish omelette with or without onions. This is a high note, the best moment to leave it. It's been a wonderful...
It's not a Spanish omelette without the onions. Jeez.
Perdón, ¿estáis aplaudiendo?
You're really clapping? You're really... Onion, guys?
Esto ya no queda...
Can I leave already? Look at that. Look at the smell. He has... So you rub your chest with onion, right? He does with candy? Anyway, what I was saying, thanks again to Espacio Fundación Telefónica, to the people from Celsius232, they're the ones responsible for having you here in this great afternoon and having spent this hour and a half with one of our idols. We love you in spite of the fact that you love Spanish omelette with onion. Juan, is there anything you want to say? But he smells really good. Big round of applause for Joe Abercrombie.
Wonderful hosts too, of course. Thank you.
Gracias.
If you brought books or something, please queue up. And think about the security guards. Queue up, you know, a queue for me and a shorter one for Joe. I'll sign here.